Hello everybody, this is another video about how to write your dissertation. This is for students especially in psychology programs, maybe in undergraduate or in master programs, maybe even in your dissertation program. Look also at my previous video on how to write the introduction. I'm now going to show you the methodology for a number of reasons. So first of all, writing the methodology is fairly straightforward. The main reason why we have a methodology is so that other people can, in principle, do the same study using exactly the same methods as you have used. Now, when you write a dissertation, you want to basically show to the people who read it, which is primarily your supervisor, that you understand the basics of methodology. And I'm going to show you basically what the structure is, like in the other video about the introduction, and then if you have questions, please leave them below the video. So for this I use my favorite text processor, LibreOffice Writer. You might use maybe Microsoft Word, or maybe have some other software. It doesn't really matter. So the main thing is that you use a system and use a spell checker. Actually, Google Docs is very good for this as well. Now, if you have the methods, first of all, of course, make sure you have your header methods. Underline it, zoom in a little bit, and I'll make my head a little bit smaller here, so you don't need to look at me all the time here for this, but it's nice to maybe see that somebody's actually telling you this. So I leave my head in the corner here, and that you can do that with the recording software, as you probably know. Now, what do we have in the methods? Well, typically you have different sections, and if you use the American Psychological Association guidelines, you know that you start in italics and you start with maybe participants. Now, this does not need to be underlined, and what you typically do is go in italics, and then the rest is not in italics. Then you have your text, and you describe here the basics of the participants that you had in your study. So you describe the sample. And I personally like it if you say, obviously, how many participants you had. First of all, how many participants did you have? And then you need to say something about the demographics. An absolute must is the age. So how old were your participants? If you don't know that exactly, at the very least say if they were adults or maybe children, and if they were children, what sort of like age range were they? Like, were they primary age school children, or maybe preschool children, teenagers, adolescents as we call them often in the literature? So that's quite important. But I think if you do a good survey, you typically also ask, how many, are you a man or a woman, or maybe you don't feel comfortable with this classification, so you have another option. But report how many people identified as man or woman, or maybe felt another classification was appropriate for them. You need to write that in there, I think. Also, so apart from age and gender, you can maybe write something about ethnicity. So so in many studies, maybe that's not being recorded. Maybe especially depending where you are. Personally, I don't find it that relevant for many studies. But it depends on your type of study. So if you're doing a social psychological study, for example, where being in a specific group can be of real importance to the data that you collected, it might be useful to have something about the ethnicity. And then but there might be other things like location, where people in a small town or in a big city. Again, for a lot of the research that my students do, that is not so important, but depends on the sort of study what you do. So I would say the bottom line here is that the things that you report about your participants might vary from study to study depending on whether they are important or not. So if you, for example, do a medical study about weight loss or something like that, or body image issues, then it might be relevant to report the average weight or BMI. So it depends on your study what you report here. So that's the thing to keep in mind. But I think the minimal ones to report are, in my opinion, age and gender. Good. So the next section probably would be about materials, or so sometimes called stimuli, or or stimuli and material. You can also separate it out, so you can have multiple sections depending on the type of experiment or survey you're doing. So if you do, for example, a cognitive psychological experiment in which you show stimuli on the screen and they're all very in different conditions, like red and green squares, then you might have a section stimuli, but you don't necessarily need that. I think this is relevant for sort of like psychophysical cognitive research. But if you do a social psychological study, that might not necessarily be relevant. And then you could just maybe have materials. So it depends a little bit, or so these headers, they can vary a little bit. But if you do, for example, a SciToolkit survey in which you have a questionnaire, you can say here, well, we use the QDOS depression measures. If you do an experiment, a SciToolkit experiment, like task switching task, I think you need to have a little bit more detail about what is the timing of your experiment. Oh, wait, that comes in the procedure. So, but you would maybe describe the stimuli here. So what did the stimuli look like? And do not only use the most important stimuli, but also what does the fixation cross look like? So, and I'll just, then the next section is about, say, the procedure. Now, what you have in the procedure depends a little bit. So if you do a survey study, you would say, well, like this was a 10-minute online questionnaire that people filled in. Mention that you use SciToolkit, right? So you need to cite the two SciToolkit papers. There's one from 2010 and one from 2017. I sometimes see that students do not do that. I find it really frustrating, because you need to actually, if you use material that has been developed by other people, whether it is a survey or specific software, you need to cite that, and if possible, have a reference. So SciToolkit has 2 references. That's important. So the procedure actually can be quite long, because remember, if you just say we did a task switching experiment, for example, or we did a Stroop task, well, then there's so many things, then what stimuli, what words exactly did you use, how large were the words, what was the timing of presentation. All these things, they should, in my opinion, be included. That's part of how you write a good method section. If you think, well, it's all just too much, you can also have an appendix. So for example, you can say, well, we used the QDOS depression questionnaire, we have the exact questions in the appendix. That's also something that you can do. So I think the method section should not become exceptionally long, so that it becomes that people have pages and pages of, say, questions. That shouldn't be the case. Details that you think are only for specialists that really want to do it exactly, for that you can do it in an appendix. Then in terms of sort of like data analysis, so this is a little bit, I think, a matter of taste, where you put data analysis. So you could say, well, for this analysis I used an analysis of variance, or I used a repeated measures analysis of variance. But I think that also can be reported in the results section, because I think if the results section is a little bit, if you just report data but it's not clear what analysis you did, that is maybe not so nice to read. But what you can also do here with the data analysis is something that you say, well, we pre-process the data with this and this software and so on. So you can put it in there. So these were some tips. So what distinguishes a good dissertation method section in a dissertation from a bad one? I think lack of detail is one of the things where you probably get scored down on. So if you just have, so and this is actually where you really need to find the right trade-off between, you don't want to report every single detail maybe, but if you have too little detail, then people say, well, I didn't have enough detail to replicate this study. You need to really tell what material you used and so on. So who your participants were. So lack of detail is one of the things. Having a good, some students do not have a good structure like this one. I think this is sort of like the minimal structure. Well, maybe the data analysis. I would not say that that is a necessity, but participants, materials, and procedure, that should be in there. Remember that also, um, you know, good grammar here makes sense. A good structure with separate paragraphs makes sense. If you do a cognitive psychological experiment, a picture which shows the timeline in uh, in an experiment can be really nice. I think describing the timeline in the procedure is quite important. The number of trials used, these are sort of like details that need to be reported in a good procedural section. Um, so you could even have the link to the experiment that you used if you use a side toolkit experiment. Um, and yeah, that's it. So the method section is important. The nice thing with the method section is that you can write it relatively early in your project. So try to write it early in your project. And I think if you have questions, ask your supervisor, because that's what we are for, right? As staff members, we want to help our students. So don't wait until the last moment. Start working on your methods, and when you run into issues, then just say, well, how do I actually do this? How should I do this? Depending on where you study, you can share it. So in UK universities, we sometimes say, well, if you write your dissertation, we only mark the final product, but we're not going to sort of like give detailed feedback on what you're writing while you're writing. But it depends a little bit. So you can ask your supervisor at the very least, while you're writing, okay, I'm working on my participant section. I didn't know exactly how to do that. What do you suggest there? But when you write your supervisor, have a specific, detailed question so that the supervisor can answer what you, because it's sometimes for us it's difficult exactly to know what is it exactly that you want to know. So I hope those tips were helpful. Use the comments below to ask for more information if you need to. Share this with your fellow students, and good luck with writing the method section of your dissertation.